Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time to welcome in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for the portion of the program which we call Talkin' Liberty. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, big news this week in terms of the D.C. sniper and the Supreme Court and whether life sentences for those who were minors when they offended are constitutional or not.
That's right, Tim. Lee Boyd Malvo was the young man who was part of the D.C. sniper team. They murdered 17 people all in. There were many states where they did commit their murders, but the majority were in Maryland and then Virginia. Well, you may recall, if you were around at the time and paid attention to the news, and I know that you did as a national capital area resident.
And people really were full of fear. People would pull into gas stations and they'd be afraid somebody was lurking.
They were effective terrorists.
They were,
to be sure.
They were.
Well, Mr. Malvo, you may recall, prosecutors in Virginia wanted to seek the death penalty for Mr. Malvo. His partner in crime, John Allen Muhammad, was executed by Virginia officials some years ago, and Mr. Malvo would probably have been executed as well, except for that he was under the age of 18 when he committed those crimes. He was a minor, and at the time the issue was still out there. It was not yet settled whether or not a minor could be legally put to death under the sort of newer rules with respect to capital punishment. The Supreme Court then, after the crimes were committed, came out with a ruling in that case, and they said it was not constitutional to give a minor capital punishment, or a person who was a minor when they committed those crimes. Then, Tim, another case came about which said from the Supreme Court, in a case where there was a mandatory life without parole sentence issued, the Supreme Court said you can do that a criminal justice system in the states, it's impermissible and violative of the defendant's constitutional rights if they're a minor to sentence them with life without parole if it's a mandatory sentence. Well, Malvo's sentence was not mandatory. In other words, he could have been sentenced to a range of sentences up to and including life, and that's what he got. So the question before the court, Tim, is that sentence also then unconstitutional?
And the answer,
well, we're just going to have to wait and see.
The answer is,
I can tell you.
What's your answer?
What's your answer? Well, I can tell you that in the several cases that have led up to this point, they have been 5-4 decisions.
Right.
And so the complexion of the court since those decisions were made has changed. And so I don't think it's just because those are the precedents that they're strong precedents. They're not long-standing precedents. They're sort of newer landmark decisions. And if a landmark decision is going to get overturned, oftentimes it will be in the first serious challenge to it with a complexion change in the court. So,
to what degree, though, in a situation like this where there's a highly emotional case that occurred that stoked fear in literally millions of people, that resulted in the deaths of 17 people in a slow trickle over a period of months, to what degree does the public emotion about, fry this guy, have any effect, do you think, on the ultimate judicial rulings on it?
I think none at all. These people are expert at divorcing themselves from these passionate issues. We're talking about life and death issues at the Supreme Court all the time. It's not like the case of a death penalty defendant who's saying they didn't do the crime. He has admitted to his crimes.
Now, let's bring it closer to home, because most people aren't going to commit murders in their lives, and certainly most people are not going to commit 17 murders. However, they will run up against speed cameras, and that's our next story, with an Ohio court allowing a referendum on speed cameras. This sure looks like good news to me.
Tim, I always like to focus on these stories because I feel like it's where the rubber meets the road for so many when it comes to liberty, and that is that if you live in a town and the city officials are getting their paychecks from the people's pockets, extracted through a red light camera company, how maddening and infuriating is it? And it's a low enough level of tyranny that few people do anything about it. It's hard to motivate state or federal authorities to do anything about it. And in this town, in Liverpool, East Liverpool, Ohio, they want to just go ahead and change the law themselves to make sure that those greedy politicians don't reach their hand into these people's pockets with one of these speed cameras. Well, the town, again, it's like they're being held hostage by the people who they pay to organize their affairs for their convenience.
Who they've elected or who they've elected and then has appointed these people, and then they're going after them.
In 2017, the city auditor, Ms. Marilyn Bosco, ruled that the referendum basically had an incorrect number of signatures or some kind of shenanigans to basically pull it from the ballot. And the question was whether or not it would be allowed to be voted on or not while that challenge went forward. The judge in this case, Columbia County Common Plea Judge Scott Washam, rules it will be voted on, and then they'll rule later on and whether or not that issue about the signatures is valid enough or not. But I think it's a great step forward for this community's people to express to their leaders whether or not they want to be monitored and taxed in that way.
I have a feeling that I know the likely results of the referendum.
I wouldn't put my money on the speed cameras.
I wouldn't either. I think they start with a stacked deck against them.
Right.
Okay, so let's move now to the federal government, or more specifically to Article 2 of the federal government, which describes what the president can and cannot do. And President Trump has issued 2 new executive orders on agency guidance. It's a bit confusing. We're counting on you to untangle this.
This, Tim, I think is one of those issues where people would be shocked to understand how consequential it is. And this is one of those things about how much of a huge difference it can make who is president of the United States, in the sense of the difference between a Donald Trump presidency and a Hillary Clinton presidency, for instance, in this regard. The issue of executive agency lawmaking is one that animates limited government advocates like few others, because what happens often is Congress will pass a law mandating, let's say, for instance, some clean air standards or clean water standards, but they don't say that a company can emit a certain amount of pollutants or something like that. They leave it up to the federal agencies to institute that kind of rulemaking. The problem is that's not a federal law. It's a rule. Well, there are certain laws regarding how those rules are applied. And one of the ways that federal agencies work around the limitations on those rules, Tim, is they issue what's called a guidance letter. So if you're in a heavily regulated area and a rule's not on point, or you're not clear how it should apply, you may ask for a guidance on this particular rule. But that's not a law. It's just some guy who works for the government who says, I think this is how it should go. Well, the problem is, and this is what the Trump administration's putting forth here, Tim, that guidance will still be able to be used as a shield, which is to say, if you ask for a guidance and they say, this is how we see this rule interpretation, and then later on they change their mind, but you have invested time and effort, you may be able to say, well, you told me you were going to do X, so I should be able to rely on that. But what we shouldn't have is these guidances used as a sword, which is to say, the law doesn't say that you can or can't do something, but these guidances are issued basically in order to compel your compliance with a regulator's wishes, not the law, because they have the mighty power of the federal government.
Well, I mean, we saw the power of the agencies with the power that was granted to the Secretary of Health and Human Services in Obamacare. They have extraordinary powers, people who are unelected, unaccountable, and distant from the people who elected the people that then appointed them.
Another example is all that Title IX stuff with the colleges. Those aren't new laws that have been passed. Those are just guidances that the Department of Education has passed down. So what the Trump administration has done, Tim, is basically say that those guidances are not to be enforced by these agencies like they are law. It's a massive level of protection, Tim, for Americans against the interference of the federal government.
Meanwhile, a federal judge has ruled that Obamacare protections violate religious freedom, a potentially significant ruling depending on the future of Obamacare.
Yes. And just to be clear, this is U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor, and he stayed his own decision given the certainty of an appeal. So there's no new law today necessarily. Right. We're going to have to wait and see, but it could be the basis of that challenge. And it has to do with the requirement, basically, that healthcare providers perform abortions who don't want to, and that's what this protection was seen as covering. That a person cannot be compelled as a healthcare provider to give end-of-life care, something like that, whatever euphemism they use for it, against their wishes, as because it's a First Amendment protected activity to honor those one's own sincerely held beliefs in that regard.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott with a smattering of me, plus The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.